One of the many themes that To Kill a Mockingbird is courage, and the cranky old lady who is unpleasant to anyone she encounters, Mrs. Dubose, is the epitome of courageousness. Mrs. Dubose was ill-tempered, racist, and the meanest old woman who ever lived, as described by Scout on page 39. She lived 2 doors up the street from the Finches in a house with steep front steps, a dog-trot hall, described by Scout in chapter 11, and a front yard covered with her beloved white camellias. She spends most of her day in her bed, cared for by her African-American nurse, Jessie, and the rest of it sitting on her wheelchair on her porch, attacking passing pedestrians with her wrathful gaze and ruthless interrogations. Harper Lee wanted Mrs. Dubose to be a paradoxical, or to be simple, a self-contradictory character, and Mrs. Dubose perfectly demonstrates that through her display of both good and bad character traits. In the early chapters, Mrs. Dubose had insulted Atticus, calling him no better than the N-word and trash he works for, on page 117. After the encounter, the readers, alongside Jem and Scout, view Mrs. Dubose with dislike. We can say that Jem took Mrs. Dubose's words a lot more seriously. This led him to destroy her beloved camellia garden in a reckless act of revenge in chapter 11. As you all know, as a punishment, he was required to read for Mrs. Dubose every afternoon after school for a little more than a month. It's not until after she dies when the readers, also Jem and Scout, learn from Atticus that Mrs. Dubose demonstrated the true courage through battling a long-term morphine addiction. And the readers see the compassionate side of her as she gives Jem a camellia to show that she forgives him for his actions and that everything is all right. Mrs. Dubose's abrasive manner contradicts with her caring and gentle side, which allowed readers to understand the duality of her. Now I'd like to move on to the house. When Scout first went into Mrs. Dubose's house, she had said, "An oppressive odor met us when we crested the threshold, an odor I had met many times in rain-rotted gray houses." From what I can infer, Mrs. Dubose's house isn't really well kept, which is why I purposely splattered some brown paint around the windows to act sort of like dirt to represent the state her house is kept in. When I opened this door, there is a scene of Jem reading the book Ivanhoe to Mrs. Dubose. I decided to incorporate this into my house because I feel like it's one of the most important scenes with Mrs. Dubose and was part of Jem's mental maturation and moral growth. On to the symbols. I'd like to first explain the clock. So while Jem was reading to Mrs. Dubose, the alarm clock would always ring, to signal the end of their session. But as Scout observes on page 125, each day they had been saying longer, which meant that Mrs. Dubose was trying to go longer each day without her medication, which was really brave of her considering the fact that she suffers from withdrawals without it. Here when I open this window, there is a dragonfly. Even though dragonflies symbolize maturity, it can also symbolize the ability to overcome times of hardship. They can remind us to take time to reconnect with our strength and courage. In this window, I drew a lion. Known as the king of the jungle, the lion symbolizes strength. I decided to draw it in black and white because as strong as a lion is, it will still pass away, just like Mrs. Dubose. And here I wrote the Chinese characters for brave and strong. Now I'd go on to explain the camellias. As mentioned before, the camellias symbolize the duality of Mrs. Dubose and how she has 2 different sides, an ill-mannered side and her strong side, which she uses to try to defeat her addiction. Under the stairs, I drew a horse and a clenched fist. This is the theme of a novel that I connected to Mrs. Dubose, which is courage. The horse symbolizes courage, strength, and power, the same for the clenched fist, and the reason for coloration is the same as the lion. To conclude, even though Mrs. Dubose can be a little too much to handle at times, she still allowed readers to see the definition of bravery and how she would never stop trying, regardless of how hard the task might be. Okay.